Yeah, thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to see so many people in the room and also so many people I don't know. So welcome to this public lecture of Professor Katrina McFerran. It's a great honor and a pleasure to have you here. She's already here since December, and she is an exchange visiting research professor funded by the Swiss National Research Fund. So thank you to that possibility. And tonight, the public lecture is a co-production here of the ZHdK Master of Performance, Music Therapy Studies and Music Research Institute and the Schweizer Musikforschende Gesellschaft Sektion Zürich. So thank you also to all these organizations that we can offer this public lecture for you tonight. And Katrina McFerran is a well-known, really world-leading music therapist and a professor for a long time in various leading positions, so for the whole music therapy program, also for art therapy program. And what's very special about the university in Melbourne is that they have a huge PhD program. So they have 15 PhD students in music therapy. And so she is supervising them, guiding them. And if you're inspired by the talk tonight, there are really fantastic books written by her, so you can make a deep dive into all their topics. They are available. She has also published articles, so research studies. Yeah, and her topics are well-being, music listening, music pleasure, and she will talk tonight about health and music listening, and I would say I give the word to you now. Big applause.
Thank you. It's always very generous when people clap at the beginning, but it was a good introduction, so I hope I can live up to that expectation. Thank you for being here. It is always, time is the most precious resource that we have at this moment, and so I'm really grateful that you have chosen to be curious about this topic and see if there's something of interest here to you tonight. I'm trying to speak in my best Australian accent. So this is as good as I can do, and I'm not trying to sound too British or too American, but rather to go for the more fluid international English. In Australia, we have far less possibilities for language, but it's a very culturally diverse country, and most importantly, it's a country that was only colonised 250 odd years ago. And so in Australia at the moment, it's a time of apology, of reckoning, of recognition, and of acknowledgement of travesty and violence that we didn't acknowledge for at least 230 years or so. So one of the ways that we do that is we integrate a little bit of language into our presentations, but most importantly, we begin with an acknowledgement. So tonight I say to you, Womanjeka, which means come with purpose. And it's a very appropriate way of greeting people and welcoming you here. And the other part of an acknowledgement is to seriously connect to the land. I'm never actually standing on the land when I say this. Even here is not quite on the land, but it's about acknowledging that the land holds so much knowledge and that the land is connected to spirit, as is water, as is sky, as is all of us who inhabit this planet, and to pay our respects to elders who've cared for land in Australia, the longest continual heritage of any culture around the globe, more than 60,000 years 60,000 years of continuous Aboriginal care for the land that we now call Australia. So I'm going to sing a song to invite us all to acknowledge that. For those of you who are not music therapists, this might feel a little bit startling. Music therapists, we have no embarrassment about singing in kind of an average way in public. So I welcome you to join me with no care for how perfect your voice may sound, because in my profession, what's important is the connection and the communication, and music is just such a powerful way to convey respect, emotion, and the depth of my commitment to acknowledging. But more importantly, it's a song where you sing back to me. So we're in Switzerland, and I'm not Swiss, so if none of you sing back, then I will just take that as being Swiss. I won't take it personally, so no pressure. If you don't want to sing, you do not have to. This could be entirely culturally inappropriate. But there are many music therapists in the room, so I know they will all just join in. So you do you, as we say in Australia. But if you would like to join me in acknowledging the Aboriginal elders of Australia, whose land it has always been and will always be, you're welcome. And it's a way of me saying hello to you. It's kind of in like an 80s rock style, just to prepare you, for those who heard the beautiful Indigenous story before. And it goes like this. I sing this song to show my respect. You sing back to me. I sing this song to show my respect. And then it goes, I sing this song to show my respect. I sing this song to show my respect. Show my respect, pay my respects. Show my respect, pay my respects. To, what is it, this one? To the owners of this land. To the owners of this land. Wurundjeri of the Kulin lands. Wurundjeri of the Kulin lands. Wurundjeri of the Kulin lands. You can go higher. First custodians of this land. The first people of this land. Swiss people sing. Hello, thank you. That's really kind, and you sing with quality. If there's one thing I've learned about Switzerland, it's quality. It's fantastic. Thank you for allowing me to be enjoying the quality of your world here. You already heard my background, so I won't speak too much about it, but for those of you who don't know me, I probably need to establish a little bit of credibility so that you take notice of what I have to say. So relevant to tonight's talk, I have written a couple of books. This one up here in the top corner, The Psychology of Music Listening for Health and Wellbeing Professionals, may be the most relevant for those of you who are not music therapists. It's an enormous literature review of a range of studies from all around the world with an inclusive ethos, which means not just studies written by white people. And it looks at the ways that we use music for health benefits in different settings with different types of people and makes suggestions. It's very easy to read. And it was designed for people with an interest, and maybe if you're an allied health professional, social worker, psychologist, teacher, those kinds of people. The other book that is directly relevant is this receptive music therapy book, but that's for probably more of interest to people who are trained music therapists. It's about music listening within music therapy. So I'm going to just be really brief with that and get on with more interesting things. Because some of you may not know what music therapy is, I wanted to start with that because I'm talking about the health benefits of music listening. And music therapists are the qualified professionals who use music to bring health benefits to people in hospitals, in mental health contexts, in clinics, and a range of places. So I'm going to start with outlining what is known about music listening as a health intervention in this professional place, this research, and then I'm going to move away from that, having built your confidence that yes, we can prove it helps, into being more useful in terms of everyday life, to provoke thoughts of how you might use music for yourself and other people for health benefits. So I'll use music therapy as a platform, but never fear, I won't just be talking about the professional practice of music therapy all night, but it is interesting. So let's start there. I took this definition of music therapy from the university webpage, so I hope it's familiar to my colleagues in the front row. Obviously, this is the English translation of the multiple languages in which it's presented. But essentially, the core of music therapy is that it is a research-based profession, which is why it's useful to start with it, where professionals who are trained use music and its affordances, I'll define that later, to bring about very specific benefits. So it's not about this piece of music is going to bring this benefit. It's how do we tailor a program that meets the needs of the patient, and how do we use their music interests, music preferences, musical willingness to help them achieve a specific goal. So differently to curriculum, where it's predetermined, in music therapy, every program for each person is entirely different. It's a little bit annoying. It just means that you can never roll out the same program that worked for the last person, but that is because people's musical interests and their willingness to use music differs, and so does their taste, and so therefore it has to be changed in every case and to meet these specific needs. So hence you have to do additional training. And for some of you that may be of interest, and there's information here about the training at this university. So having defined music therapy, this is a rather lovely, almost 3D hierarchy of evidence. And for those of you who aren't aware of that, when we're talking about health benefits, it's important to think of the medical context in which health is situated. And the medical context, of course, is designed for people to be able to be healed or rehabilitated for physical and acute illnesses as well as chronic illnesses. And that system has been built on a range of systematic styles of objective research traditions, which is different to the way that many music traditions have been investigated also brilliantly over time, but from within a more humanities perspective. For example, think musicology. Very different traditions of research to the medical traditions that I'm positioning here because we're talking about health benefits, yeah? Not because it's better. It's not. It's just a different perspective. So this hierarchy of evidence that comes from medicine is really useful. It was established by an old dude, to be Australian, called Archie Cochrane, who was very concerned by the fact that physicians or doctors and nurses were continuing to practice the way that they learned at university, and they weren't really getting up to date with the latest new discoveries. And so there was a systematic movement that occurred within medicine to find ways of ensuring that medical practitioners had access to the most recent discoveries, because things change and we need our medical professionals to be up to date. Now that is a very worthy decision. And in order to enable that, he established this kind of hierarchy, because expert opinion, you'll see here, is positioned at the, I'll say, the foundational level It's got the largest part of the hierarchy of evidence, but another way of looking at it is that it's at the bottom. Take it as you will. But expert opinion is actually very helpful. When you go to see your doctor, you're going to get their expert opinion about what they think of your headache or your arm or whatever it is. You're not just looking at Google, disastrous thing to do, as you all know, to find out what your symptoms mean. They're being interpreted for you by somebody who is an expert in doing so. So expert opinion is in the hierarchy, but it is at the foundation of the hierarchy. And Archie Cochrane's idea was to build up more than foundations. So at the next level, we see how medical research progresses to case studies. So, does this particular intervention help one person? If it helps one person, does it help two people? If it helps two people, etc., etc. So we're still looking at the level of the individual. That is level 2 in the hierarchy. Think Freud, think whoever you like, but most great discoveries begin with a case study, and the medical world honours that kind of discovery. But to get more objective, moving from the individual's subjective experience to the objective, then we start to get quite technical with research. And this is where the clash between music as a health intervention and music as a culturally situated phenomena that is rich and individual can sometimes start to get complex. Cohort studies, when we start to say, can we generalise from these people, these individual cases, perhaps who all have the same diagnoses, can we generalise to other people who have the same diagnosis? Under what conditions could we expect the same outcome for that, for example? From there, we introduce increasing levels of difficulty. Can we randomise people into different groups by making sure that they don't know whether or not they're receiving the pill or the placebo? Because, of course, human beings are wonderfully, wonderfully responsive to the idea that they might be helped by an intervention. The placebo is not a negative. The placebo is a fantastic part of the human brain that we do not quite understand, but it helps a lot in all things from medicine to music therapy. But we do like to try to control for it when we are trying to establish whether something really does help or not. And control conditions, one of the pinnacles of objectivism, I find totally amusing because it means you close your eyes and you put your hand into a bucket. This is randomisation, sorry. You put your hand into a bucket and you pull out somebody's name and you say, I'll give them music therapy, and then you close your eyes again, and this is on a computer now, obviously. Close your eyes again and you pull it and you go, no, they won't have music therapy. And this is the top pinnacle of objective research. It's highly amusing. And it takes ages to put into a spreadsheet, what's more, which is just crazy. But, so people get randomised to different situations, and then we control for the degree to which the intervention has been the thing to make the difference or not. Control means we compare it to not having it. The placebo, if it's drugs, in music therapy, very difficult. In music listening, you know whether you listen to music or not. There's no disguising that, and it's a big problem for our field. It really is, because you're trying to control to prove the benefits, and you've already broken. You can still close your eyes and randomise, but you've broken one of the major tenets. So it's a bit annoying, but it's very valid when you hear about it in a pharmacological sense. Finally, Archie Cochrane became the father of systematic reviews. And a systematic review is where you take many randomised control trials and you bring all of the data from each of them and you bring them in together to see whether or not the results are still significant, even across different contexts. And it's a fascinating thing to do, but it does require a series of standards to be met. Those standards are very high in order for them to be included in the systematic review. Okay, lecture on Archie Cochrane, complete. Music therapists are overachievers, and so they have done a lot of randomised control trials despite the difficulties and systematic reviews despite the difficulties. This is the most well-known. There are a few others that I just thought the page was getting too messy and irrelevant. I'm pointing to one here highlighted by Friederike Hasselbeck and her team here in Switzerland, which is the musical and vocal interventions to improve neurodevelopmental outcomes for preterm infants. But there is a range here canvassing mostly health contexts, because this is a health style of research: preoperative anxiety, cancer care, dementia, schizophrenia and schizophrenia-like illnesses, depression, mechanically ventilated patients, etc. And I did also include Kira Jesperson's listening to music to reduce insomnia, because I'm going to talk about her fantastic work later, but that's not actually a music therapy study, please note. So we do have quite a lot of research. It's not perfect. The significance is not always very high. The sample sizes are nearly always too low. Blinding is impossible, etc. But there is an enormous foundation of evidence to show that music and music listening can have health benefits. That being my point for the first part of the lecture, that it's actually okay and you can relax. The answer is yes, it can be helpful. Now, how to understand music listening in the context of music therapy is the next piece I'd like to put on the table, as we say in Australia. Do you say that in Switzerland? Good. Music listening does occur in music therapy, but it is one of the 4 main methods. It's called receptive music therapy, and it means that people are engaged in the act of musicking, the verb created by Christopher Small, a musicologist from the UK, the verb of making or being musical with people, but listening instead of improvising, composing, or playing along and singing. So it's the 4th method in music therapy, and it's one of the less prominent methods here in Switzerland and in some other countries. And in some countries it's more prominent than, for example, improvisation, which is the main method that's used here in Switzerland. They're all fine, they're all good. But for this lecture, what I'm focusing on is particularly my work in receptive music therapy and how we use music listening to bring about health benefits. As I mentioned earlier, that isn't a simple task to integrate music listening, because it requires the use of this treatment model, which again will be familiar to anybody from medical backgrounds, but not so familiar to people from other backgrounds, which means that each patient is referred for particular reasons, they're assessed, the medical team does the medical assessment, and in music, what we need to assess is people's musical capabilities, interests, competencies, resources. We have a range of words for it. But in terms of music listening, what kind of music do they enjoy listening to? What is their favourite music? Because that is often a starting point, if not an end point, but a very important point, which is what we'll come to when we engage you in thinking about your music listening. As I said, we then plan and implement programs uniquely to every single person and group that we work with, document, evaluate. So yes, book on receptive music therapy. But on either side of that, we have 2 other health interventions which also use music listening as fundamental to their existence. One of them is guided imagery and music. It's in some ways, it's an advanced form of training of music therapy, but actually there are guided imagery and music therapists who are not, guided imagery and music therapists who are not music therapy trained. So it's not the same, it's an extension. It has some similar premises, but it's importantly different with music listening, because it involves the guided imagery and music therapist selecting predetermined programs of music that are specifically designed to fit together to take the patient on a therapeutic journey. And that music largely comes from the beautiful classical Western repertoire, which is perfectly suited to fostering journeys of the imagination, which allow insights into challenges which might be experienced at an unconscious level and to explore one's own identity. A very profound method of therapy, very specific form of psychotherapy in which music listening is 100% central to that. So there is also a good deal of literature and research about guided imagery and music. On the other side, we have the no therapist involved music medicine use of music listening, which also occurs quite a lot in health settings. So music medicine is where it's not therapeutically tailored to the specific needs of the individual. It's about the music being introduced as an intervention of itself without therapeutic curation, if that's okay to say, but nonetheless drawing on the power of music to, for example, promote relaxation, promote distraction from painful stimuli, enhance connection and identity making. So there can be a lot of ways that music listening is used as a health intervention that are not therapy and do not require a therapist. I think that's nearly all the complications we need for getting this ready to go. Okay? Oh, timing's excellent. Right. So to explain how you might be able to understand how music listening works as a health intervention, now that we've said, yes, it does, I'm going to just assume you're with me on that. You're welcome to read the literature. But how does it work is a really interesting question. And Daisy Farncourt is a fantastic researcher from the UK. She's been funded by the World Health Organization as well as the British government to investigate what could the possible mechanisms of action be that connect arts and leisure activities to health and wellbeing outcomes. She uses a pharmacological metaphor for explaining that, because when we do try to understand how drugs lead to certain outcomes, we can break it down into thinking what are the active ingredients that are required to trigger particular mechanisms which would lead to specific types of health outcomes. And she writes very well if you want to get into the how of it. But what's important about her work in arts and leisure is that she describes how it's a complex intervention, how it doesn't work pharmacologically, despite being a useful metaphor for trying to understand how music works, that actually it's this interaction of active ingredients that is the key to triggering these mediators, which you might not be able to see so well. Biophysiological mechanisms, I said mediators, I meant mechanisms, sorry. Biophysiological mechanisms such as arousal and stress, or things that you might see through molecular biomarkers, is one mechanism, one road that you can take to health benefits. Another one that she has identified based on this enormous review of a huge range of literature, all of which has been peer-reviewed as being a very concise and rather brilliant explanation. The second one is this neuropsychological mechanism. So when are we triggering these kinds of pathways of emotional elicitation and regulation, cognitive regulation, or psychological needs? When is that the pathway to outcomes? And she also identifies these social behavioural mechanisms: social connection, self-awareness and identity, and behavioural change. So she distinguishes them and talks about the fact that in music, arts and leisure activities, it's a complex combination of shared contextual moderating factors. So all therapists would, for example, be empathetic, responsive to people's needs, caring, etc. So that's shared. But what are the unique facets in our case tonight of music, which make these active ingredients leading to triggering these mechanisms which lead to health outcomes. A little bit more complicated perhaps than you might have dreamed it would be, but it's worth getting your head around this, because then you can really apply these principles quite readily. At the biophysiological level, Kira Viva Jespersen, who I mentioned earlier, Danish, fantastic. She's actually a trained music therapist, but she's a music psychology researcher at the Brain Institute in Aarhus in Denmark. Has written this very nice white paper. If you ever want to read a solid but clear overview of the connection between music, the brain and health outcomes, freely available online and very well written. And what she identifies, which many other people have identified, is that there are many ways that music excites the brain. The auditory system being the most obvious, but kind of necessary. There is ways that we can still have a musical experience despite having a profound hearing loss, but the easiest way is through the auditory system. Rhythm and motor mechanisms, arousal mechanisms, emotion and pleasure and cognition, which are kind of touched on in the previous slide as well. And my work most recently has been on the pleasure dimension of that and activating the limbic system. But in addition to this sort of brain structure, the roads, you might say, of the brain, there's also the traffic in the brain. And that is another area that music has an enormous influence on the brain through these neurochemical pathways of dopamine, oxytocin, endorphins and serotonin. Although Robert Sartore in the lecture on Friday night was saying that there's a question mark next to endorphins, actually, about whether or not music functions as strongly in triggering endorphins as perhaps dopamine, oxytocin and serotonin. For those of you who aren't familiar with those words, dopamine is the great high, the joy, the buoyant optimism, energy, power and knowledge. Oxytocin is the bonding that's often triggered by music, similarly to breastfeeding and making love. The similar kind of oxytocin activation comes from music, which is quite spectacular. And serotonin, which is the mental relaxation and the sleep promotion and the soothing, which many of us are familiar with. So that is relatively straightforward. I can put a picture up, I can point to parts of the brain, I can talk about how things pass through the brain at this level of biophysiological mechanisms, and you're probably agreeing with me that that makes a lot of sense and probably connects to your own experience of listening to music. It makes you feel high, it makes you feel calm, it makes you feel connected at different times. The others are a bit more complicated. I was going to just mention Patrick Uslin's work. He's really focused on emotions rather than music listening per se, but he is considered to be quite the guru of connecting music and emotions, Swedish researcher from Uppsala. So if any of you are looking at music and emotions specifically, I highly recommend his work, which really looks at music induction. Briefly, when we listen to a piece of music, we may have two responses. One of them is induction regarding emotions. We might feel an emotion. So the music might have us induce a feeling in us. On the other hand, we might just perceive emotion in the music. We might say that is a frightening piece of music, that is a dramatic piece of music, but it might not actually make us feel frightened or us feel sad. And in fact, we might enjoy the sadness. We might take pleasure in the sadness there. So that's not induced, but rather perceived. It's a detail. We don't need to go into it, I'm sure. When we try to understand the complexities of music, this is where we start to lean more into music sociology and more cultural studies, understandings where conditions and contexts are highly influential. And so I just very briefly wanted to point to the work of Tia Denora, who is the greatest music sociologist with relevance to music and health. Her contributions have been extraordinary. She's just on the borderline of pretending to retire as we speak. I'm writing a book with her at the moment, so she's definitely not retired. But her work is extraordinary, but as with all sociology, quite complex to understand if that's not the tradition that you've come from. So I will try and put it in a nutshell for us. Nutshell, yeah, thank you. Okay. She draws on Gibson's work, which has been around for more than 40 years when he talked about art. And here it is, appropriating the affordances of music as an alternative to stimulus and response. Appropriating is when, for example, I go, oh, I'm feeling a bit tired, I'm going to use this object to sit down. I'm taking an action, I'm sitting down. I could keep talking too because I have the microphone, but I won't. I'm using. In my research in healthy and unhealthy uses of music, I say use. It's not technically correct, appropriate is technically correct. But using. The affordances of music are where you'll find this fascinating. So a strong piece of music, be that Beethoven or metal music, affords intensity, power, strength. It is suggestive in a particular direction. So I can appropriate the affordances of that chair. That chair looks nice to sit on. It invites sitting, but on the same hand, I could stand on it. With music, metal music invites power, but it can also be deeply soothing and relaxing for some people. So it's not a box. All people don't experience it in the same way. It's about how people appropriate that potential, how people use the potential of that style of music. Some people use it to work themselves up. Some people use it to relax. Hence, we have human beings involved in this whole musical experience, which brings me to the last theoretical piece. Phew. These are two of the main models beyond medical framings. That human actors have agency, that music is not a reliable input that we all experience in the same way, that music is something which offers us as human beings a rich and fertile ground for our emotional and social worlds and dream worlds. It's full of possibilities, and we as humans are responsible for how we take advantage of that. My research in healthy and unhealthy uses of music, emphasis on the unhealthy, unfortunately, for example, talked about the ways that we can ruminate with music. So we can take a beautiful piece of music that we love, we can associate it with a particularly nasty thought that we have about ourselves or others, and we can ruminate on that over and over, listening to that song again and again and again. I've done a TED talk on it. It's probably my most concise explanation of appropriating affordances, if you're interested. But we can also appropriate the same piece of music for most beautiful outcomes. So that's a model which recognises that we humans, as we see in the world right now, have a lot of agency, and we can do what we like with it, sadly, in some cases. On the other hand, in music psychology, there's been, and brain studies, there has been a really good attempt to try and work out, is there anything we can say that makes us like Pavlov's dogs? That's what that's all meant to be about, where just a certain kind of music will reliably result in a particular response. And yes, you can train yourself to have associated responses with music, but it's through this kind of human acting in the first place that will do it. So yes, you can hear a piece of music and immediately be triggered to a memory, or immediately be triggered to, oh, that's my running music, I've got to go. But it does take a little bit of rehearsal, which musicians know. All right, I'm going to move on from there because I want to spend the last 20 minutes talking about you. So, marvellously, across all of these different disciplines, in the last 15 years, I would say, we have all come to agreement that even in lab studies, in brain studies, certainly in qualitative data, everything, self-selected music is the most powerful way to investigate the health benefits of music and music listening. Emphasis here, which I hope I've built to marvellously so that you believe me, on the self-selected piece. So it's not that a particular piece does this to everybody, it does it to you. You may have tried to convince your lover, your children, somebody about this fantastic piece of music and how it will help them relax, only to have them reject your suggestion. So you might know what I'm talking about from personal experience, but you might have been lucky enough to have friends and family who agree with you, and so you have not had this experience of being able to recognise that people react differently to the same music. So that brings us to one of my most fascinating questions from my sabbatical, which is to think about, if this is the case in this model of music leading to health benefits, could it be true that musical selection is a mediator? So we've talked about mechanisms. Now I'm introducing this word of mediator of health benefits. So could it be that if you select the right music, then you have a much greater chance of achieving your health outcome, your health benefit? I think yes. That's my, I'm going to call it a theory, not a hypothesis for tonight. For all the reasons which I've covered before. So let's have a look at that possibility in relation to your life. Now, you can flick open your phones if you want. What music would you select for your own health benefits? I'm going to go into more detail, but I want you to notice this question and try to answer it in your head. What music would you select for your own health benefits? Just give you a minute, not even, probably 20 seconds. I'm so impatient. Okay, so let's talk about the music and then we'll talk about the health benefits. Musically speaking, I can predict with a certain amount of security that you all came up with a different piece of music. There's a small chance that there was an overlap of one or two. And again, I'm not Swiss, so I perhaps don't totally understand how things work here. But it is highly likely that the music that you listen to that make you feel healthy in some way is all different. And that is exactly as it should be according to theory and research. So we need to really accept that. It is frustrating, I know. Music therapists would be rich and powerful, and as I like to say, we would bring about world peace immediately if we could play certain pieces of music that would trigger a reliable reaction from people. We would absolutely do that. So nobody is more disappointed than me. But it's really important to recognise that your selection, your agency, is critical to your ability to achieve health benefits from music listening. It's your thoughtfulness, it's your intentionality, it's your clear decision making, right? So music as a mediator means how do you personally select the right music for health benefits? As it happens, I've been thinking about that quite a lot, starting back with my first casual article about it in The Conversation back in February of last year, and increasingly talking with experienced music therapists all across Europe and the UK for the past 6 months, as well as reading constantly of the literature, as one does on sabbatical, such a delightful time. And at the moment I'm sitting with a palette of at least 8 different ways of choosing music. So for those of you who are interested, I'm not talking about functions of music, I'm talking about choosing music, an active human decision-making process. And these are the ones that I'm sitting with at the moment. So if you look at those 8 different possibilities, what songs would you choose for each of them? And if you would like me to try to translate it into German with some help from my friends, you can use these, but they may be imperfect. So again, just giving you space to think, would it be the same piece of music for each of these, or could you identify 3 or 4 or perhaps even 8 different pieces of music? Technically speaking, I would love to think there was 8. In reality, we actually use the same piece of music for different purposes, especially our very, 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 very favourite pieces of music. So it may be that for some people there is one piece of music that can do all of those things, but as a music therapy expert in designing interventions that lead to health benefits, I would advise that being a little more discerning about specifically why you're making that choice could better mediate the effect that you will see. I'm placing that in a very conditional and couched way because it's possible that one piece could do, and I'm sure that many of you are thinking, definitely, one, I have that one, and it is everything, and that's good too. I'm not trying to get in the way of that. But it is entirely possible that you might choose different music from your personal preferred repertoire for each of these kinds of goals. So I just want to take us down a little rabbit hole into my favourite one of these goals, which is pleasure. As I mentioned, I've been talking about and researching this through the lens of anhedonia, the loss of pleasure in previously pleasurable things. It's a transdiagnostic symptom associated with a range of chronic illnesses, very underdiagnosed, not that well known by many people, but actually a very pervasive symptom where things that previously brought you joy, such as a piece of music, no longer do so. But more importantly, hugging your children, and other things that motivate you to be engaged in the world, catching up with friends, etc. So the loss of pleasure leads to the loss of motivation, and in a health context, it leads to poor treatment adherence because it's very hard to keep doing things when you're not getting anything from it. That's how the reward system of the brain works. And yes, I put a picture of the reward system up there to make the point. Kringelbach talks about these hedonic hotspots that are triggered by a number of things, but most commonly the old sex, drugs and rock and roll is the most easy stimulants for triggering pleasure in the brain. Music is always up there. Music is a remarkably powerful stimulant to the brain for a range of reasons, including pleasure. It activates a number of parts of the reward system, but most importantly and most relevantly, it affects our motivation. It affects our hedonic capacity, our joy. So there's anticipatory pleasure, like I want that feeling of like, oh, I'm going to go on that roller coaster, if you like roller coasters. I'm going to make snow angels after a sauna, which I didn't find pleasurable at all, but some people did. So this anticipation, I'm going to get really cold after being really warm, is, different for everybody, I would say. So there's the anticipation of pleasure, there's the experience of pleasure, this hedonic, this reward liking, some people call it consummation of pleasure. And then a third important aspect of the reward system is the learning that occurs. Oh, I enjoyed that. I might do that again. And therefore I might be willing to make sacrifices in order to be able to do that again. Obviously that goes wrong with addictions, and that can become a very negative cycle, but for many people it's a very useful cycle that motivates us to engage in the world, and music is a fantastic trigger for it. We are able to see that in the brain, and my group is doing brain studies at the moment. This is my brain, just out of interest. It's not telling you anything particularly interesting right now. What you can see is a comparison between my brain listening to music that I chose to be pleasure-inducing compared to music that I chose as neutral. And we did get some activation in some of the areas that we hoped to see it, mostly the auditory cortex, but also a bit of the orbitofrontal cortex, etc. These things need much larger samples than one brain. One brain doesn't tell us a lot except a pretty picture on a slide. But we are doing a study at the moment where we're trying to see whether or not we can actually use a music listening intervention to improve anhedonic symptoms. We've seen it on self-rating measures of diagnostic tools of anhedonia, and in subjective self-reports, we're looking to see if we can get an objective measure of that, because it's very hard, as I mentioned earlier, to get objective ratings of music therapy's effectiveness. It would be great if pleasure would do it. We can see musical pleasure, but how do we know what pleasure is, what musical pleasure is? Let's keep this simple. Let's focus on musical pleasure. How do we know what musical pleasure is? How do we know if it's an emotional reaction to music, like, oh, that music makes me happy or brings me joy, as compared to pleasure, which is an embodied sensation? There's a little bit of cognition involved in it, in that you have to attend to it for it to occur, but it actually is quite distinct from emotions. I did a synthesis of the literature, and it was so complicated to try and distinguish between what was it sort of out of bounds of pleasure on that side and what was out of bounds on pleasure on that side when thinking about music, that I ended up writing a chord progression as a way of trying to artistically render the complexity of such phenomena. But I thought I'd do an experiment here with you now. Are you ready? I'm going to sing a song that brings me pleasure. And what I want you to do is to notice how you react to that song, to me singing that song in this room, in this moment, when there's only 5 minutes to go. That should up the pleasure a bit. Just because I want you to concentrate on your embodied response to it. I'm not a singer, so this is not about aesthetics, by the way. This is a different phenomenon, which is about pleasure. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Who's that young girl dressed in red? Wade in the water. Must be the children that Moses led. God's gonna trouble the water. Okay. So I suspect, because I am not Eva Cassidy, that it wasn't the aesthetic qualities that would be the triggering point here. This is my point. I know that as I was singing, I could feel in myself the pleasure that I take from this song. I prefer it when I sing along with her, honestly, but I also enjoy singing it by myself. And these are a kind of summary of what we have so far theoretically identified the feeling of musical pleasure to be. And that is, it has a positive valence. So if you were like, oh, that's definitely not pleasure. Pleasure in a kind of dimensional scale is when it's above the line, which puts negative valence here, negative, call it feeling here, and positive feeling there. So you're looking for pleasure as something that definitely is at the positive end. It doesn't induce sadness. That's poignant, but it's not necessarily pleasure, right? It's consistent. So I know that that song consistently brings me pleasure. It just, every time I hear it, especially Eva, I feel it, right? So pleasure-inducing tracks are consistent. There is always the first time you heard it, and you might have felt it the first time you heard it, so that's not out of the picture, that's in. But when you hear it, you get that, oh, I love this song. I don't know how other people do it. Mine's a breath in and it's a kind of feeling in my chest, but in our, there's no consistent. It is a sensation though. It's an embodied sensation. Hence the embodied. It's also brief. Pleasure is not an extended experience. Pleasure is a relatively brief experience. It may not last through the whole song. You may have multiple experiences of pleasure through the song, but in itself, Pleasure is not something that's particularly extended. We don't walk around, unless we're extremely lucky, in a state of high-level pleasure. As I mentioned, you might need to be cognitively engaged, to be listening to it, to be focusing on it, to be able to allow yourself to have the experience of pleasure, and it can be psychologically filtered. The most obvious example being people who used to love a song and had that, and then, for example, the artist behaved in a way that made you despise them, and you no longer choose to listen to their music for that reason, and you can completely turn off pleasure when you hear that song. So it's psychologically filtered, but it doesn't come from that place. It's an embodied sensation and reaction. So I would invite you over the coming, I like to say weekend, but it's only Wednesday, I think. I would like to invite you to think about how you might select music using this kind of palette of colours. I encourage the pleasure-inducing tracks as a beginning experiment for you to see, can I find in all of my favourite songs the ones that make me go, oh, whatever it is for you. It's a great way to spend the weekend, as the people who were the healthy volunteers in our fMRI study love to tell us how long they spent choosing the 5 pleasure-inducing tracks they needed to turn up with to be a part of our brain study. It was very cool. But it is worth doing this exercise of working out what are the songs that I would use, and then this is the annoyance of being a music therapist as well. You actually have to do the kind of experiment. I think that will be motivating for me. Let me see. I'll try that. Is that the one that's going to get me off the couch to go for the hike or not? If you remain on the couch, the answer is no. That is not your motivating song. That's not going to be the one that does it. Again, you can work towards an association which will be better with that. But have an experiment with everything that you try to do. Does this song put me to sleep or not? If it's too stimulating for you, it won't work. But you can't intellectualise your choosing of music. This is the appropriating the affordances. You actually have to experiment. And what a music therapist does is we then tailor and we change depending on what we observe or what people report to ensure that the intervention that we've designed is helpful in the direction that it's meant to be going. So it's important to use this palette idea that came from the workshop on Saturday to mix the right colours from your personal palette of songs to achieve health benefits. It's also important to remember, as I briefly said, you're responsible for how music affects you. So if you are struggling with a mental illness at any point, if you are stuck in ruminative thinking, venting and isolation are 2 other unhealthy uses of music that people can get in a habit of. It's always healthy, isn't it, until it goes over the diagnostic line. We all ruminate a bit with music, but if you're struggling with a mental health situation and you're trying to feel better, probably listening on repeat to a song that connects to sad or dark ideas is not going to have the same result you might expect, where you express, and then feel better. It just might not work that way every time. Please be careful of that. Give it a go, watch the experiment. But rumination and music is a big issue. To finish, 1 minute over time. Music therapists are qualified professionals. We do have an association of music therapy here in Switzerland. You're more than welcome to contact them. I believe they have a broad membership which encompasses people who are interested in music therapy as a profession as well. But there's also a fantastic webpage. But for you, you can very easily apply these principles. Just you have to move beyond the assumption that the same music does the same thing for everyone, but also that the same music will do the same thing for you today as it might do next week. Take, for example, the song of the person that you fell in love with in the past, not the one you're still married to, somebody else. You fell in love, you had a love song, it was beautiful. You then crashed and burned, the relationship ended, and now when you hear that song, it's a very different association, right? Same song, different outcome. Easy to remember, huh? So just please be choosing music in your life that is tailored to bring about those health benefits that you seek. Thank you very much.